What's up guys? This episode we're talking about the Draper gem, how you can use it to add decorators to your Rails app. Now in the last episode I explained what decorators are, how you use them, and how to build them from scratch and why you would want to use them. So we're going to talk about implementing them with Draper in this episode. So the reason why you might want to use Draper over your own implementation is that it's actually integrated super deeply into Rails, but that could also potentially be a problem because if you want to upgrade your Rails app, then you are probably waiting along for Draper to get upgraded to be compatible with your Rails version. If we scroll down here to the installation instructions, we just need to add Draper to our gem file. Now, if you are using Rails 5, you'll want to grab the pre-release version of Draper because the active model serializers XML dependency or library is not included in Rails 5. So if you were to install the latest stable version, that won't work with Rails 5 yet. So this now depends on active model serializers and everything should be good if you use that. So go down here, we'll paste that in, and we want to make sure we get that pre-release. So let's grab that one and paste that in. Then we can go to our terminal and run bundle and run our Rails server right after that. So as you can see right there, Draper is designed to be heavily integrated to Rails, so you will get things like that where if Rails changes, then your Draper gem is going to have to change, or you're going to have to use a version from GitHub, and it's not going to be near as stable as building your own decorators where they're going to have a less deep integration with Rails and you have more control over it that way. But there are some great benefits of using this gem, such as whenever you generate a resource, it will automatically create a model and a decorator for you, but you can also just generate a decorator with the command line, which is great. So we can go in here and we can say, let's generate that user decorator, and we'll try and recreate what we wrote in the last episode. So here we get a test for the user decorator, and we also get the decorator in the exact same location as we saw before. So let's take a look at that and see what's different. This time we have Draper decorator that we inherit from, and that's going to provide us all of the methods specific to Draper, such as the initialize, so that we can take the object like the user automatically and it creates the initialized methods and stuff like that. So we don't have to do any of that. For us, it will also take care of the helpers for us. So we get that view context that we had to pass in ourselves. We get all of that access to that via the helpers method. So helpers, or the alias for it called H, can allow us to create those content tags or link tos or anything we want inside of the decorator here, and we already have that all set up for us, which is nice. So let's talk about how we instantiate the decorator, and then we'll talk about how we can use it and how it's different from our own version. So if we go into our controller, let's imagine that we were logged in and we had a current user object. This could be decorated by just saying decorate on it. And so this will work for any sort of active record model. You might say user.first.decorate, and that would give you a user decorator back. So it just looks at the class name of this object, whatever you give it and call decorate on. We'll look at that class, it will say, oh, this is a user, so therefore we need a user decorator, and we initialize a new one of those objects and we give that back to you, and there you go. And you have that decorated object. You can see this in the console if we run Rails C and we say user.first.decorate. This should give us a user decorator object back, and we can see that the variable inside object, that instance variable inside of our decorator, is pointing to that user that we pulled out. So that means that this is pretty much doing exactly the same thing as if you were to say user decorator .new and pass in user.first. That's just a helper method that they add to active record base so that you can go in and call the decorate method on any of your individual objects. So that works well, and you can also use this option if you would like to specifically pass in that class. So this works just as well. Now for collections, it's a little bit different, but it also goes to active record base. So if you have an active record relation, you can say the same thing. So whereas before we did the map and we took these and we said user decorator dot new, and we passed in all the stuff like this, you can actually say at users dot decorate, and as long as at users or whatever you call decorate on is an active record relation, this will work just fine. So if we go into the console and we say user.all.decorate, we are going to get a Draper collection decorator back. So this has wrapped all of that. Now, if you were to do an array, that's not going to work. So if you were to say, let's grab all the users and convert it to an array, this is an array object. It is not it's not an active record relation. So the Draper helper method is not available here, but you can say user decorator dot decorate collection, and you can pass that in and do the same thing if you have an array rather than a active record relation. So that will work as well in case you were doing something like that where you need to go and filter or sort your results using pure Ruby and you end up with an array. You can absolutely use this for those as well. What this means is that for our show views and our index views, we can just assign the decorators to the instance variable as a replacement for our normal version of this, and that can be more fluid that way. And this can be done the same way if you do decorators from scratch. You just have to remember that you were operating with decorators. Now be careful with this, because when you're doing an update, you don't want to update at user and do that on a decorator. You want to make sure you do that on a user model, and then at the very last moment before you go to render a view, you want to then make the at user model or a user instance variable a decorator and not a model. So what you would do here is something like this. You would say at user, or you could do user equals user.find params ID, and set that. Maybe you don't do an instance variable intentionally. So then if you say at user.update and your params or whatever you pass in, then maybe here you say at user equals user.decorate. And that way you know that the only time you assign instance variables, you can make sure that they are decorators. So you know that you're separately working with the database when you're calling update, and decorators when you're in your views, because you don't want to call update on a decorator because that's only designed to work with views and to display that information in an interactable way. So you could pass through a decorator to do that, but that is not a good idea, and that totally defeats the purpose of using decorators. So don't do that. So one of the ways that Draper is designed to help combat that is to actually introduce a decorates assigned method that you can put in your controller, and you could say here user, and what would happen is you would operate on your user model just like normal. You would set your instance variables, and then in the views, if you ever wanted to call at user, you would not do that. You would actually use user without that. So you would just say user here. And of course in the views, this would be ERB tags around that. And what that means is that this, when it gets accessed in the views, we wouldn't call this instance variable directly in the typical fashion of saying at user. We would call user, which would be a helper method provided by the controller that this defines. So if we want to test this out, we can try and say users here, and our index action, which we have defined with the decorators, we can actually skip the decorators, save this, and if we go and look at our user's index, we want to change the instance variable to call that helper method that gets defined there. And if this works, then we will see in our browser the exact same output, but all of these will have been decorators that were automatically decorated by Draper. So that's really nifty to have that built in. That way you don't have to worry about doing the decoration yourself. And if you do your own decorators from scratch, you can actually build that little helper method as well, because in your controller there, this is effectively just defining a users method here and saying a helper method users, and then this would just return you at users.decorate. And that's about it. So this behind the scenes is doing a pretty simple thing, but it's already done for you, and then ends up cleaning up your controllers so that there's no real knowledge of decorators happening. It's kind of automatically taken care of for you by accessing the right methods and never using instance variables anymore. So this is pretty good. I like that. I like that a lot. So that gives us that ability, and if we wanted to, we can go into the view and we can say index.html, and let's do a console here, and this should give us that console at the bottom, and we can access the user's function. And if we go up to the top, you will see that we get a Draper collection decorator, which has the object, which is the active record relation. And at the very end, we can see that there is a whole big list of user decorators that we get. So we get user decorator and the object for each one of those, and it's basically doing that map that we did whenever you call that on an association. So the decorator stuff works really nicely and isn't obtrusive in any way, which is what I like a lot. So we can learn a lot about if you wanted to build your own decorator stuff in your own Rails app, you could go and replicate all of this stuff. You just have to define those methods, those helper methods, to be compatible. So all of that handles our controller concerns about the decorators, which is a very important thing. We have to make sure that we assign the decorators at the right time and we interact with them at the right places. And this does a really good job of that. I'm really impressed with this solution because it makes it very seamless and doesn't end up changing our code hardly at all. In the views it does a little bit, but that's it. So we don't use instance variables anymore, but that is it. Now, when you want to implement one of your decorators, for example, we want to implement that full name method that we had before, and we have access to that object, or alternatively, you can call it model, but it is actually named object internally, so you can use that, and you'll see that if you inspect the user decorator. And so here we can call it object.firstname, and we can also call object.lastname, and update our view to print out those names. So we can say full name and go to our views and test this out. And we see that we get the full names, and that is combined for us wonderfully. Now, one of the benefits that you get from the inheritance from Draper Decorator is that if you wanted to, you can use the method missing that it implements to delegate all of those calls to your object. So when you call first name or last name, that is going to basically throw an error, except that error gets caught by the method missing function that Draper Decorator implements, and then it's going to attempt to call that on your user in this decorator. So it will call whatever object that you passed in and then try to call it on there. And that way you can end up writing this code similarly as if it was inside of the model, and you don't have to write any of your specific delegate methods like we did before. So you can get rid of this delegate all and you will lose that functionality, and you can do the delegate like we did before, where you could say first name, last name, to, and here you would say object. So you could do an explicit version of this, or you can also use the delegate all, which will use the method missing implementation. So here we refresh again, and we are now using that method missing implementation that will automatically pass those over to the object. Now I'm going to paste in the two methods that we had before for the staff badge and the moderator badge. And you'll remember that we passed in the view context variable here, and that gives us access to all of the view helpers and everything like that. And we can do the exact same thing by saying helpers or the method .h or h dot whatever, and that is just an alias for helpers, and that's going to give us the exact same thing. So it's pretty much the exact same implementation there. So you can say h.content tag, so you have a nice short method there. And here we can say user.modBadge and user.staffBadge. So with that implemented, we can refresh and we'll get those badges back just like we did before, and our implementation is almost exactly the same. One interesting thing I want to point out here, I wouldn't really recommend this, but it is kind of nifty that you can say include Draper lazy helpers, and this is actually going to do a similar delegate thing in a sense where all of these methods for your helpers will get mixed into this decorator, and you can say content tag directly without specifying the helpers or h dot ahead of that. And so you can kind of write these as if you're both at the same time inside of your model and inside the helpers, which is interesting, but I really wouldn't recommend that approach because it's important for you inside of a decorator to know the differences between which methods are helper methods and which ones are user methods, or whatever model you are decorating those methods. And so it's important to separate those, and you're also not including a giant amount of helpers directly inside of your decorator. So Draper gives us a lot of niceties here, but what about the case of pagination? This is one of those things where pagination actually is kind of a view thing, but it's also just as equally a database thing because you have to worry about your limits and your offsets. So if you said you want 10 results per page, then you need to limit to 10, but you may be on page 5 and you need to skip the first 40 or 50 records and then take the next 10. And so your views need to know a lot about the database on how to calculate those. And if you were using a gem like Paginate or Kaminari, you need to figure out how you want to integrate that with your decorators. So do you pass this through your decorators or do you not? And there's a couple options that you can do with this. So let's install Paginate here. So I added that to my gem file, and I've already run Bundler to install it. So we need to go into our controller first to add Paginate, page, params, page, just so that it knows what the default page is. And then we can go into our views and add the Paginate call, Paginate. And we have to pass in the users into this. So which one do we pass in? Do we do @users or do we use the users decorators? Well, really, as long as you're decorating at the very last moment, then you can use your @users assigned variable and know that you were operating with your database models. And so this is never interacting with Draper, and that's probably the way that you want to do this. So you would skip Draper entirely for your pagination, and you're going to be able to refresh, and you'll have your pages and everything will work just like normal because you aren't actually even using decorators here whatsoever. Now you could pass in your decorators if there was some reason you needed to, but if you refresh this page, you're gonna see that you're gonna get a few methods missing, such as total pages, because your Draper's collection decorator is the object that you have there. It's a collection decorator, and it needs to implement some methods in order to be compatible with Paginate or Kaminari or whatever else you're using. Draper's docs have some information about this, and you actually have to go and build another decorator called Paginating Decorator, and then later on you can say this will be the collection decorator class. So let's go build this out and show you how that works. So I'm going to clear this up and this one, and inside our decorators folder we want to create a new one. So we want to call app decorators. We want to call this Paginating Decorator, just like they have in the example, as you can see here, Paginating Decorator. So we will create that .rb, and we can paste that in, and this is where we want to do that delegate. So I'm using Paginate, and so that is the list of methods we want to delegate. And you'll notice that we have to do this decorator because there's two things that we decorated. Number one is that we can decorate a relation, so a set of records we can have that we decorate, and then we also have an individual record. And so a set is actually a bunch of individual records that are decorated, but the collection is actually what will paginate and Kaminari you're going to care about, not the individual ones, which means that we can't implement these methods inside of the individual decorator. We have to put it in the collection decorator, and so we have to define this class to specifically delegate these methods, and there is no delegate all that we want to do here for the collection because it's a collection. It isn't an individual record. But once that is done and you've saved it, you can grab the self collection decorator class snippet here, and we can paste that inside of our user decorator at the bottom and keep that all nice and hidden away. And that should do the trick for us, and we can get rid of this example. And if we go back to our browser, it all works again, and we are now using pagination through our decorators. Now, of course, there's almost no reason that you would need to do that if you were doing the decorates assigned, but for some reason, if you didn't have the access to the models directly with the instance variables, then you can use this as a solution for paginating your decorated collection. Now, we've already gone on very long, so I'm gonna cut this off here, but there's a lot of other cool stuff that Draper can do out of the box, such as decorating associations. So you might have a blog post, and you might have an association for comments. Well, when you access the decorated blog post and you call comments on it, it's actually gonna call the association normally, but you can also use decorates association inside of your decorator so that when you call comments, it will actually call Draper around those comments, and then comments will be decorated as well, so you can have that automatically connected and set up so that you can issue those associations in your views just like you normally would, but they will automatically be decorated, and so you can trust that you're always working with decorators in your views, and that's pretty nifty. I like that. So there's some other stuff you can do. There's finders, there's context stuff, and I would encourage you to check that out in the README if you want to learn more about it. But I think that Draper does a pretty good job of implementing this. But as you might have noticed, we got a very, very long ways into building something just like Draper, and we hardly wrote any special code to pull that off. So you can definitely build your decorators without a gem and do a really, really easy job of implementing that. There are a lot of niceties that Draper gives you once you get into more advanced decorator stuff that you might want to just use the gem for, so you have that already ready to go when you get around to that. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know in the comments below. Like this video if you enjoyed it and want to see more design pattern stuff. And I will talk to you in the next one. Peace.